What is going on, YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review the debut album by Cameron in the UN. Basically, this album is called Heat and Hair Volume 1, and it came out in the spring of 2010. Now, the thing about this particular project is Cameron had done a number of projects with Vado, which is basically the accompaniment to this particular album. There's not really terribly much to the UN. This is basically Cameron and Vado and like a few minor guest verses from some other cats on here. But for the most part, Cameron and Vado did like a series of mixtapes called Boss of All Bosses. There's at least 3 or 4 of those. I want to say there might be 5. I would have to say I reviewed the first one. I reviewed Boss of All Bosses 1 back in September. So those are some mixtapes. Definitely recommend those. But Cameron kind of got like a second wind in 2009, and he dropped a 2009 album called Crime Pays. And then in the summer of 2009, he started putting out like and in the summer of 2009, he started putting out the Boss of All Bosses mixtapes. And then there was the Boss of All Bosses 2 that came out in early 2010. And then we got to this particular project. So some of this is just leftovers from like the Boss of All Bosses days. So some of this is just leftovers from the Boss of All Bosses days, but I would have to say it's interesting that this is kind of an album just because there's not a ton of information about this particular project, and there's even one song particularly on here that I'm not going to be able to review just because I can't find it anywhere. The whole concept about it kind of is this album is not on iTunes, it's not on Spotify, and it's not on YouTube. The whole thing about this album is it's not on iTunes and it's not on Spotify, and the thing about it is 13 out of 14 songs on this particular album are on YouTube, but there's a 14th song on here which is called On My Shiznet, which I just couldn't find anywhere else. So I didn't feel like having to purchase this album in order to review it. So I kind of said, from what I gathered from it, this is a pretty interesting album. But the problem with it is, I mean, it's kind of muffled somewhat. I kind of feel like in terms of the quality behind it, it's good in like certain contexts, but kind of similar to the problems I had with Boss of All Bosses. There are some kind of lagging songs on here. There are some kind of lagging songs on here that kind of drag this project down, but I do like the kind of album quality appeal that this particularly kind of has. There's definitely some good gems on here, like the Boss of All Bosses mixtape that I reviewed back in September. Definitely had some album quality hits on there. There was like some ones. There were a couple nightclub songs on there. There was some good city flash on Boss of All Bosses, and there were some nightclub songs on there, and there were some hit songs on there like Blow My High and some of those type moments. DJ Drama helped out with that particular one. But just to kind of talk about this one, I kind of feel like I was trying to discover if there was like a single to this project. It seemed like there kind of was. It took Wikipedia. It took Wikipedia quite a while to finally make an article about this particular album. I remember for the longest time it didn't have one, and this is kind of an album that just doesn't have a ton of information about it. It makes me question if it's on Amazon and stuff like that, just being able to say if you could purchase this. I mean, it's just a very low-key project. I kind of figure that nowadays most folks don't even realize that this album kind of exists. It's the fact that, Cameron and Vado did drop an album in 2011 called Guns and Butter, but this is kind of the album before that. And this is kind of one that the UN just kind of had a different name. And I just feel like, between like the UN standing for United Nations and that type of stuff, and just kind of the fact that there's just not a single and stuff like that, it's just kind of a hard to find kind of dicey project that kind of has the concept of just kind of being here and there with whether or not folks are going to know about it. But this is like the next album-wise thing that Cameron did after his 2009 album, Crime Pays. So I just would have to say it's kind of the concept now that like I said, I'm not sure if there's like a single off this particular album. The debut first week sales of this album was only 3,700 copies. The debut first week sales of this particular album was only 3,700 copies. So that's really like sluggish kind of territory. That's more of like, Cut Calhoun and people like that, Ritz kind of territory as far as that kind of happens. Maybe not Ritz nowadays, but Ritz back in like 2013, some stuff like that. So just more underground type folks. This is definitely kind of an underground album. I would have to say. But the concept about it is there is some decent quality about it on here. Just the thing about this particular album is there is some quality on here, but it's just kind of dicey. And I would say out of at least 13 songs I was able to listen to on this particular project, I wound up recommending to you 5. So it's not, out of 13 songs I was able to listen to on this particular project, I wound up recommending to you 5. So it's not a heavy amount, I would have to say, but I'll go ahead and recommend those, and then we'll kind of talk about it. So the 5 songs out of 13, minus On My Shiznet, because I don't know about that song that I recommend, would be Like Shit, Throw It Up, It's Your Party, Cuffin', and Butta. So some of these songs like Fed Story, Horror Story, La Bamba, some of these songs like Fed Story, Horror Story, La Bamba, and Ride With Me are all songs that were kind of on Boss of All Bosses 1 or 2. These are just some ones that you've heard on like the mixtapes. So some of these are just kind of elsewhere. But then I would also say the song Butta is a song that was on. Song Butter is a song that was on Guns and Butter from 2011. So that would be on the next album later on. But this is kind of the concept about it. There's just kind of some fairs on here just to kind of talk about it. I kind of feel like there's not, like I was saying, there's not a ton of songs I really recommend. It's just kind of some bunk stuff, not in like a horrid sense, but just kind of the concept that some of these I kind of felt like should have stayed on Boss of All Bosses, the mixtape. Because some of these, what they really needed, in my opinion, was just more songs like Shit, Throw It Up, and Cuffin'. Those were definitely some of the best moments on this album in terms of like a sheer nightlife. And I definitely feel like Cameron with his swag rap, definitely feel like Cameron with his swag rap type lyricism and just overall sheer and kind of flossy type vibes needed more songs to kind of convey that. I mean, there were definitely some higher bops. I do feel like the Boss of All Bosses mixtape is just a better type project to go and fuck with as far as that kind of happens. Just had more gems and bops on there to kind of mess with. But this one really kind of just has a lot more. Like, I kind of feel like this particular album is just very much a city stepping kind of album, whether it's traverse. This album is very much like a city stepping type album, whether it's on foot or through car traverse, I would have to say. So it's kind of the concept about it. There's just a lot of good tunes for that in this sort of concept. But some of these are, this album just has like a pretty sheer kind of edginess towards it that just doesn't have like a staircase as far as that kind of happens. Like, you don't get like stepping stones as far as going towards it. It just really has like some of these sheer type ones, like songs like Kill 'Em, Fuck the Other Side, Fed Story, Horror Story, La Bamba, Ride With Me. Some of these type ones are just kind of more edgy and just more overall sheer rugged type ones. It's just not really like kind of commercial rap as far as that kind of happens. This album just doesn't really have like sheer radio ready or commercial kind of bops on here for the most part. It has like maybe one or two, but for the most part, this is kind of more edgy, hardcore kind of East Coast kind of rap as far as that kind of happens. So that's kind of the concept about it. But I would have to say, talk about some of these, talk about some of the highlights. Like Shit is kind of like a glissy breeze of like a midday outing. I would have to say this is swag rap to a T, I would definitely have to say. And it's just a nice floss song with like a jazzy kind of bopish. This is just kind of a jazzy bopish kind of city tune. So this is definitely one. This is one of the more litty beats on here. I definitely feel like Shit is definitely one of the more litty beats that just has a lot of good glissy bounce as far as that kind of happens. This is definitely a song that there needed to be more like. This is an example of a good kind of plus moment on here that just the album was kind of on short. It's definitely kind of like a glissy bounce of a moment that just had a shortage in this particular affair as far as this kind of happened. Votto and Cameron do a great job with this particular stuff. Votto is a good kind of street soldier, East Coast soldier that just works pretty well in these sorts of songs. And Cameron just has like the swag rap really down, I would have to say. So it's just some good concepts about it. Another good highlight on here, and this is like the only song with like a real kind of super noteworthy kind of rap artist on here, and that would just be Cuffin' with Gucci Mane. So I'd have to say he's probably the biggest name on here, but this Gucci Mane is probably the biggest guest name on here. This is kind of, Cuffin' is kind of like a pumped up kind of vintage mixtape like nightclub cut, I would have to say. This is a good Gucci feature, definitely. I feel like he had a pretty likable verse on here, and this is just like a likable kind of hip dance jive of a song, I would have to say. So this is kind of like a good dance club kind of song. This is a good bounce just for something for the chicas, that type of stuff. Just something kind of in the sense of just having like a good commercial ready, radio ready type fare. I definitely think that this could have been a single if it had had the radio promotion, that type of stuff. This one and Like Shit are two ones I feel like have the most commercial bounce, but there's just not a ton of songs like this one. This one kind of has like a kind of gimmick type beat where you kind of rap along to the beat as far as that kind of happens, more so than have like a regular kind of flow. But I kind of feel like it's just a nice one to kind of have. It's really kind of slinky type beat, and it's really kind of an electronic one that just works pretty well. It's probably one of the album's best beats, I would have to say, definitely. And Like Shit's a pretty good glissy type one also. But Throw It Up is a pretty good highlight on here. This is like a lively, kind of quick-paced city flash of a song, I would have to say. It's a good tune for some consecutive good evenings, definitely, and this is just kind of a brazen bop. So this is one that's a little bit more litty in like a hardcore kind of East Coast rap kind of sense. Definitely a more riveting kind of one. Reminds me of something the Diplomats would have done back in the early 2000s, something like that. This one just feels like vintage Dipset as far as that kind of happens. It's good to kind of get Cameron and Votto on this particular one. This works pretty heavily, this would have to say. It's just a good concept as far as that kind of happens. Definitely like this one. Another good follow-up to that would be It's Your Party. This is a jolting kind of city lights tune, I would definitely have to say. It's a good companion to Throw It Up, like I was saying, and this is just a solid night venue kind of jiveness tune, I would have to say. So this kind of one, this one just kind of has like, this is kind of in between like Shit and Throw It Up, just kind of an in-between where it has the litty. It's Your Party kind of has the litty kind of breeziness of Like Shit, but it also kind of has like the hardcore kind of bopish kind of sense, this kind of more riveting sense of Throw It Up. So it's just kind of an in-between one in that sort of sense as far as that kind of happens. Definitely like the appeal of that one. There's definitely, I'm glad that there were some songs like this, but I kind of feel like this album is kind of weak on like the rest of the cuts that this album tried to deliver. There's just not many moments besides the litty moments that really hit the nail on the head. Even with Cameron's kind of souped up lyricism and Votto's good lyricism also, it just doesn't really have that concept. But One that's kind of a highlight off of the 2011 album Guns and Butter, like I was talking about, is the song Butter. And this is kind of a preview of that. But this one's kind of a sardonic, kind of spring weather, like hop and bop pep of a song, I would have to say. It's an easy kind of city traverse tune. And it just has some shrill lyricism, definitely, and it's a vibe, I would have to say. So it's definitely one. This one's just a real kind of sarcastic kind of tune. Just like the concept of this one. It's kind of one great to listen to April, May, June, something like that in the spring weather as far as that kind of happens. Just a good kind of bopish one, that sort of sense. When it's green outside and that type of stuff. This works as like a good city pizzazz as far as that kind of happens. It's kind of one for just appreciating the sights and just the bright sunny skies as far as that kind of happens. But it's just kind of one, just kind of in a standard rugged kind of thuggish kind of sense as far as that kind of goes. But I just like the concept of getting this one, just kind of a little bit of peppy kind of one. Definitely like the vibe of it. But yeah, there's not a ton of songs like this either. This is just kind of a good surprise kind of song, I would have to say, but there's not many songs like it. So it's just an interesting kind of concept. The lyricism's on display here and it works. Basically, to talk about the other 8 songs on here, there's just not a lot of good moments on this particular project apart from like the 5 songs I listed. Like some of these like intro, or some of these like La Bamba and Ride With Me. Like I didn't like Ride With Me on Boss of All Bosses just because I kind of felt like that. I mean, that was a decent kind of beat. It could almost be like an almost song, but I kind of feel like it just didn't quite have the edge that I was kind of looking for. I feel like they definitely needed, for an album quality type stuff, they definitely needed to have more moments. Like a lot of this is just kind of like pretty standard East Coast thuggish type rap as far as that kind of happens. And these are just really the dramatic flair about some of these songs, like Ride With Me, Horror Story, Fed Story, Kill 'em. Some of these type ones are just pretty sheer hardcore rap as far as that kind of goes. Just the element of just like standard gangster rap that just doesn't have much else to offer apart from just the rugged kind of sense of just like that dramatic kind of bravado. So this is kind of the concept. Those are just some ones that kind of are like that. Really felt like the beat on La Bamba is pretty terrible. That's probably one of the worst beats on the album. I kind of didn't like Sex Tape that much just because it didn't have Cameron and Votto on there. I don't know why they gave that song to Felony fame, and they didn't really have much reasoning to really introduce that cat. So I don't really like. I would have almost liked the production on Sex Tape, but it just kind of felt like an odd one to kind of have without the standard UN crew on there as far as that kind of went. I would have to say like Kill 'em was kind of like a storytelling beat, but I just kind of like some of these are just more dramatic and rugged than probably like the overall theme of this album. It just did not have a lot of jovial kind of moments as far as that kind of went. This just felt like a different kind of vibe for kind of stepping out in like a more kind of mission and kind of more just dangered kind of sense, more so than like the concept of just like having a good riveting time, some smoke sessions, some dance sessions, some stuff like that. So this is kind of the concept. I mean, if that's the angle that you're looking for, I mean, that's the concept of it, but it just didn't have like a ton of recreational kind of vibes on here. It's just pretty like stone cold. It's just pretty stone rugged as far as that kind of happens. There's just a bunch of these beats that kind of have that particular lack of compelness about it that just are kind of like that. It's just some kind of poor beats on here. The whole album is basically produced by Arab Music minus one beat, and the concept is some of these are just pretty just straightforward for the most part. So it's kind of the concept. There definitely need to be more bopish ones. This is kind of the concept for the most part, but I just would have to say that's kind of the thing about it. So there's just like 8 different songs. Some of these are just kind of like standard. Some of these are just kind of standard, interchangeable, just kind of East Coast gangster rap. But they don't really jump off the page in much else of a setting. So this is kind of the concept about it. So me recommending 5 songs out of 13 on this particular album, I'm going to go ahead and give this album like a 4 out of 10. I kind of feel like that's about as much as I can really do with it. I just would have to say it's just not got a ton of appeal as far as that kind of happens. There are enough bops to kind of recommend in like a minor sense. I do feel like there are enough songs to recommend in like a minor sense. I do feel like some of the lyricism on here is pretty compelling, but there's just not enough productions that really display that. So I'd have to say it's kind of the concept gets a 4 out of 10. The social score I'm going to go ahead and give like a 3 out of 10 though, because there's just not a ton of bops as far as that kind of happens. Just the overall display as to how some of these songs kind of happen was just not very noteworthy. The overall display of this album was just not very noteworthy, and there needed to be a single on this particular project. It just was not very good promotion as far as that kind of happened. I mean, Cameron is noteworthy as he particularly was in the late 2000s, early 2010s. It just didn't really display this album as the way that it kind of needed to be. So it's kind of a disappointment as far as that kind of happened. So it gets a 3 social, 4 score, I would have to say. So in terms of the future, that's kind of difficult because Cameron and Votto don't really collaborate like that anymore. But I would have to say Cameron still does music. He still dropped projects, and so does Votto. He still dropped like mixtapes and stuff. So they do have like separate projects as far as that kind of happens. But I would have to say, I mean, this is barely worthy enough to kind of recommend in terms of a purchase. There are enough to kind of say that there's a decent amount of kind of noteworthy hits, but for the most part, over half the album, over 60% of this album is kind of lousy, I would have to say. It was just kind of the concept that there are some gems. It's just not in a very high abundance.